Last week we saw 5 tips on how to choose your first camera. This week it gets spicy. We will talk about exposure. Welcome to my channel and welcome to episode 2 of Learning Photography on YouTube. If you're here for the first time and you don't want to miss the next episode of this photography course, it might be a good idea to subscribe. Before entering into the exposure topic, I want to let you know that towards the end of this video, I will give you some practical assignments that you can do at home, as I'm a strong believer that in order to digest and make ours every single new piece of information, it is very useful to put them in practice. So if you have time, I hope you will do your homework. So what is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light that reaches our camera sensor if you're using a digital camera. In film photography, exposure is the amount of light that reaches the film. Photography is light. And our cameras are nothing else than a box that captures light. If the camera captures the right amount of light, you will have a well-exposed image. If there is too much light, you will have an overexposed photo, too bright. If there is not enough light instead, your image will be underexposed, too dark. Nothing very complicated here, but how do we control how much light will reach the camera sensor? The light enters into the camera through the lens, and there are 3 key factors that will control how much light gets to the sensor: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I will dedicate a video to each one of these pillars, as they impact our photos in multiple ways, and we will see how later on. For now, instead, let's just say that the combination of these 3 elements creates the so-called exposure triangle. So let's define these 3 pillars one by one, very quickly. Aperture is basically the hole within the lens that you are using, and this hole, just like the iris in our eyes, can either expand or shrink, open or close. Every lens, in fact, will have different apertures, which are called f-stops. A wider aperture will let more light enter in the camera, and it will be defined by the smaller f-stop number in your lens. Shutter speed. The shutter speed is the exposure time. As a matter of fact, we can control how long our camera sensor is exposed to the light. If the shutter will stay open for a longer period of time, so-called slow shutter speed, it will let more light in. If the shutter instead will stay open for a shorter period of time, fast shutter speed, clearly less light will have access to the sensor. And the last component, the last pillar, is the ISO. The ISO determines how sensitive is our sensor to light. An higher ISO number will result in more sensitivity to light. So with higher ISO, we will need less light. With lower ISO, we will need more light. As you probably understand, I'm trying to keep this definition as easy as possible to understand. But to make it super clear, I'm going to use a very well-known example that will clarify once and forever any possible remaining doubt. So imagine that your camera is a bathtub and light is water. To have a correct exposure, we need the right amount of light in the camera. And in this example, we will need to fill the bathtub with water. The aperture variable is the faucet, where if we open it at its max aperture, we will need less time to fill the tub, while if we close it and let less water flow, we will need a much longer time to fill this tub. So in this example, water flow and time work in combination to fill our tub, like aperture and shutter speed work in combination to achieve a well-balanced exposure. And what about the ISO? Well, let's say that in this example, the ISO is the side of the tub. A higher ISO will make the tub smaller, where less water will be needed. Like in photography, a higher ISO sensitivity, as we said, will require less light. Is it clear now? If you still have any doubts, please let me know in the comments and I will try to respond to every one of you. So now we should have some basic understanding of what is the aperture, what is the shutter speed, and what is the ISO. Let's put them in practice. But let's not forget that today's cameras do have an exposimeter built in. So if you just put your camera into a program mode, the camera will do everything by itself. Will decide what ISO to use, what aperture to use, and what shutter speed to use. But because all these elements do control multiple things in our photos, we want to make sure that we do understand how to use them manually and how to decide which aperture to use, which shutter speed to use, which ISO to use. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to use manual mode right now. Another very important tool that will help us to create and have a balanced exposure is this scale. You see on the right of my display a scale that goes from minus to plus, and in the middle there is a value of 0. Of course, the balanced exposure will be achieved when we are able to get a value of 0. And you will see how by changing the value, in this case of the shutter speed, I am able to bring light to my image in this preview, for instance. So right now with the ISO 800 and an aperture of f10, I need to increase my shutter speed to a value of 1/13. And right now I can say that I have a well-balanced exposure. But if I keep this shutter speed and I change, for instance, the aperture, and I increase the aperture, meaning that the whole of my lens becomes wider, so more light comes in, you can see that I am going to have an overexposed image with the same values. So let's bring it back to f10. But then again, if I change the sensitivity to light of my sensor by changing the ISO, you will see how my image, for instance, in this case, if I reduce the ISO, meaning that the sensor will be less sensitive to light, this image is becoming underexposed, almost pitch dark. So let's talk about homeworks. This is what I would like you to do. Set your camera in manual mode. Take a first photo adjusting aperture, shutter speed and ISO manually. Try to achieve a balanced exposure, like we just saw, where the exposure meter is right on 0. Then right after, take 3 more photos of the same scene, where on purpose you either underexposed or overexpose your image. One change in the aperture, one change in the shutter speed, and one, of course, changing the ISO. If you want me to see your assignments, post your images on Instagram, tag me at Photography and use the hashtag LPOY_exposure. I also encourage you to make notes of the settings you use in the different exposures. Maybe you could even write them in your photo description. And we are done for today. The second episode of Learning Photography on YouTube is over. Next Thursday, we are going to talk about aperture. Put a note on your calendar and make sure to be there. I hope that you learned something new today. And if you did, hit the like button now. It will help me grow in this community and create more quality contents for you. And if you want to see those contents in the future, maybe consider to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.